Good afternoon and welcome. This is actually very intimidating to have a podium. And my intent today is not to stand up here and present or feel like I'm lecturing, even though we're in a university environment. This is a lunch and learn, and I'm here to learn from you as much as you likely want to learn from me. But more than anything, you're also sitting in different tables among your own peers. So it's an opportunity for you to learn from everyone in the room, of which I'm only one of many. I'm also delighted to see a few familiar faces. Gary Yee, who's a longtime colleague of mine. I don't even know how many different paths we have crossed in our lifetime. Kathy certainly, Darren Cooney, whom I've actually worked with just a couple of years ago. So you never know, these paths always, come back. So Maytree is a great, great organization to, find different ways to help people connect it, but also find different ways for people to learn from each other. So I'm very pleased with the kind of model of how they bring diversity and help actually educate and develop, not just educate, but help each one of us develop to be a better person, to be a better board, or be a better volunteer. I have deliberately today chosen not to use slides because slides, it's like going back to school, right? And having slides just means, here's a Bible and here's, bullet point 1, 2, 3, and it's too much of the thou shall or this is the best way to go. I've chosen today to take a bit of time to really frame a little bit more higher level strategic framework around diversity on board. Because in a lot of the travels that I have done in both consulting as well as in my volunteer work, my own learning has been that a lot of people look at diversity on boards as just another check-off box of things to do. And more often than not, a lot of people take a look at it without giving enough thought or context in terms of where is our organization at this point in time of the life cycle of the organization. Are we at a startup mode? Are we at a maintenance mode? Are we in a growth or expansion mode? And that kind of context of the life cycle of the organization has a tremendous influence over the kind of board that you need to have and the kind of board you want to have. So the approach that I'm using today, and you have the one-pager that you have on the table, what I thought I would do is to talk about 3 or 5 ideas, but these ideas are not on its own. These 5 ideas really formulate a fully integrated, a fully integrated process to help you in a very systematic way to determine the type of board and the type of approach you would use to make sure that your board is effective and how you integrate diversity in there. So that's kind of the framework that I've chosen to talk about the topic today. How many of you in your organization are in a startup mode as a board? Nobody? How many are in regular business mode? And how many are in a growth or expansion mode? How many are in downsizing mode? Downsizing meaning there's a lot of pressure out there in the marketplace in terms of funding and so on. So you have a good mix in terms of both the life cycle of the organization. In terms of board and the role of the board, as you know, the role of the board is really in 2 very critical parts. The role of the board is to set direction for the organization, and then having set the direction, the role of the board is to make sure that there are controls and systems in place to make sure the organization is performing into the way that you have established those directions. So first and foremost then, in terms of thinking about board diversification, you have to go right back to square one. The square one is, do we actually have a good understanding as to what is the role of the organization, the mandate of the organization, the vision of the organization? And more often than not, that kind of conversation needs to take place, every couple of years because the external environment changes so much. So most boards would tend to undertake a bit of that, step back, step up retreat to take a look and validate your vision and your mission. And along with that, you would take a look at directionally, have you set the kind of directions and priorities that the board wants the organization to be in. So you would hear more often than not, and I'm sure you have done it yourself in your organization, most boards would undertake some kind of a strategic planning workshop or retreat. Every few years, if you have a strategic plan, you would probably want to take a look and say, are we still relevant given the changes that are out there? And if we're not, then what might be some of those directions that need to be tweaked, or are there new things that we need to contemplate? So that kind of discussion at the board level is a way to have the kind of conversation for you as a board to really galvanize the directions that you want that organization to undertake. So that's a really fundamental piece first, to determine, refresh, and have agreement as to what the directions for your respective organization is. And if you have that foundation in peace, and if that foundation of your strategic directions are in place, and if those directions are communicated with both internal stakeholders, staff, service delivery people, as well as your partners and external stakeholders, then you have at least that assurance that that direction is well understood, that people have bought into, and therefore will adhere to. So having that very critical foundation is very important before you even then layer it on top about, okay, so what do we have at the board? What kind of expertise do we have in terms of our present board? Are those the kind of expertise, knowledge, skill sets that will continue to serve us well? So I'm now on actually the second and the third idea, and don't think about those as just sequential. Because when you start looking at the board is at the top of the pyramid of an organization. You're up there to provide that direction. So you're very much at the very top of the pyramid in an organization to set those directions and make those decisions. So those responsibilities are very, very important. Pardon me. So when you start looking at now what is the board, the makeup of the board now as it sits, then you actually have to have a good understanding as to what kind of knowledge, skill sets, what kind of networks people have that are currently serving on the board. And for not-for-profit boards, most people tend to be very polite. They tend to be polite because as volunteers, people are there because they care. That's a given. More often than not, it's a given. People are there because they absolutely care about your organization. And because of that, people don't feel comfortable sometimes to say, geez, is it okay for me to ask, somebody's resume? Or if you have different board members that come in, over different terms, the people who joined initially will know each other, but then next year you have some turnovers, but then the new board members don't know the old members, and the old members maybe the old members tend to know more about the new members, but not vice versa. So having a good understanding as to your colleagues at the board level, what those skills, what that knowledge, what kind of networks they have, is just a good practice. So my first suggestion in that regard is don't be afraid to ask and don't be afraid to share. So this is not to kind of question people's credentials, but it's very much a way of understanding what kind of capability, what kind of capacity that you have at this moment in time. So it's very much just a baseline, understanding. And if you have that baseline understanding, then it will actually help you to think about, well, then what do we need on a go-forward basis? So it's not just, there's two people and their terms are up, so we have to fill in their seats. But then you say, yeah, there are two seats, but do you know what you need? So that's when you actually have to think about and use your strategic plan to guide you. So hypothetically, if your strategic plan says, we will explore partnering opportunities with 2-3 other service providers in this particular area. And if that's a direction, then you say, okay, at the board level, what do we need? Do we have people who understand building a service partnership in that particular area? Would it be helpful if we have somebody from that particular subsector or sector? Would it be helpful if we don't have this type of expertise in our board mix to actually have that as a complementary piece as we go forward? So a lot of people think about board skills and board mix as static. So my advice is do not. Do evolve. Do evolve the kind of mix that you need. And when you do evolve that, piggyback it onto what your strategic needs of the organization. So the two actually are complementary to each other. So it is a bit of a dynamic balance because you have to look at, whose terms are up and whose terms are renewable and whose terms are not renewable. And then you have to marry that with availability of people. It is very much a leadership development exercise. So think about your board as the same as your senior management team in your organization. So you have to apply the same discipline. So you wouldn't want to hire or recruit your senior management team just based on the chairs up, so we're going to hire exactly the same skill sets. You would want to take a look and refresh and say, are we up to date or do we need other things? So you apply exactly the same HR discipline to your board in terms of your board determination of needs, and then the processes to execute on that is the same similar HR discipline. It's not any different. So part of that is just demything around board and who you want to recruit, how you recruit. It's the same discipline. So if in your day job you already are in that kind of a function where you actually play a managerial role, where you actually have to plan your resources, you have to recruit your staffing and so on, it's the same discipline, same process. But more often than not, boards don't do that. They worry only about, we do have to make sure that we know who we hire in terms of the CEO and profile, but they don't look at themselves. And again, it is tough when you're in a volunteer environment. More often than not, it's usually the people who care very, very deeply about the organization and their success. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. That's kind of your minimum requirement. But you do want to make sure that you have a good, diversified mix of people who may not have exactly the same experience and knowledge, but it's also good to have people with different perspectives. So the definition of diversity these days have moved way, way beyond, race, culture, background, and so on. It is about having the most inclusive experience, knowledge, expertise from multiple sectors, because the board is really the most, important part of the organization, and it calls for very different skill sets. You're not doers. You are not there to do the job. You are there to actually provide guidance, insight, as well as oversight to the organization. So those skill sets are much more strategic and very different than if you were hiring a day-to-day, manager or operations. So push yourself up a bit, in terms of really thinking about what type of mix that is. So I'm actually going to go to good idea number 2. So one of the tools that's being used a lot now in terms of board recruitment is a little tool called, board matrix. And it sounds really fancy, but it's really a table with 2 axes. And I can certainly share with you a template because they're all over the place and they're free, they're all over. But essentially what you want to do is to make sure that you have clearly identified the type of skills, knowledge, expertise, networking, stakeholder relationships as your requirements. And then there are always ones that you want for your organization that are a must-have. And then you can also have another list that are the nice-to-have. The nice-to-have mix will be the ones that you want to just, keep refreshing every year. But the must-have are the ones that say, any person that we want to join our board needs to have these basic, foundational skill sets. But the not nice to have, but need to have, that's where it can help you actually rebalance, every time if you have a big gap in a particular area. I'm actually moving a little fast, so if there's things not clear, just raise your hand because, as I said, this is really, more for interactive. And I'm going to stop later on and actually, have you work through each table some of the things that I have said. Yes, Sally? Valley? Uh-huh.
And so the budgeting of the Toronto Zoo to be taken over by the federal government as part of the protected park.
Uh-huh.
Now, in a situation or a decision like that, is it the board that will make that decision with the city, or is it just the board that acts on its own?
This is a very loaded question. I didn't read that particular newspaper item, so I may be just a little, I'm only speaking from my perspective. When you have an agency, because that's not a not-for-profit, that's actually an agency, right? It depends on your governance and accountability agreement with who actually owns you. Like, who do you represent as your shareholders? And I don't know the Toronto Zoo well enough, but I'm only guessing that it is set up as an entity within the City of Toronto construct. If that construct changes, that will have to be some discussion between municipal government and federal government. So that's not even the board. That's just between 2 levels of government in terms of that higher level accountability, within which if they had reached an agreement and said, well, if the zoo now is actually an agency of federal government, then you have to fit yourself into the more federal government process. And if that's the case, then it may actually cause the whole restructuring of the board. It wouldn't be a board decision. Because a board for any organization is responsible for what goes on within the walls of that organization. Unless you're going into, let's say in the health sector, where you're going into like voluntary integration with another entity, then you do have some of those discussions that would take place between board to board. But you have to kind of follow the, what decision authority does this board have, and then what other decisions will be made by other levels above the board. So does that help? Okay. So we're going to come back to that board matrix a little bit later on. So assuming that you do now have a matrix for your organization that actually says, here are the 4 or 5 skills, knowledge, experience that we must have, and for this next round of recruitment, we may need, people with, external stakeholder skills in this particular subsector. So that determination of what you need on the go-forward basis do need to be brought back to the board level for discussion so that everybody buys into that. And that formulates the basis for which then you can start your recruitment process. I'm guessing that many of you actually have had recruitment process where it's essentially either people around the board or volunteers that say, oh, I think so-and-so is really good, you know, he or she will be great on the board. So, okay, sure, and that's it. But I think if you're going to put a bit more discipline to make sure that you have the right kind of people on the board to play that very important role, then you want to have a bit more discipline. Not that you don't want volunteers, don't get me wrong, but you want to have a little bit more disciplined approach to make sure that you have the right people on the board to guide this organization, because those responsibilities are becoming more and more onerous. And if you're funded at all by public sector, that accountability has moved up the chain quite a bit in the last couple of years. Very, very large. And that becomes, so when that accountability moves up, there's also liability on the board that goes with those accountabilities. So I think, you know, again, reflecting back on your own organization, you know, you have to be really up to speed about what those expectations are of the board, so that when you're recruiting people, people will now actually ask you, so what are the expectations? More often than not, the first answer that comes out of most people is, oh yeah, half an hour or maybe 2 hours a month. And I said, hello, what else? And then that happened to me too, this last year. I said, I'm not asking about how much time you need from me. I said, what are the expectations and what are the liabilities? And when I get that silence at the other end, I said, oh, I don't think this is a board that really have thought through some of these things. So they're very, you know, more and more with boards now, that responsibility has become quite a bit more serious. And therefore, when you look for volunteers at the board, you have to express that to people, not just how much time you have available. Okay? So then I'm just on good idea number 3 and then rolling it into 4. More and more organizations now want to make sure that they operate in a very open, transparent manner. So when you are recruiting for potential board members or even people to serve on the committee, it's a good idea to have your process written down. And the process does not have to be pages and pages. You know, it can just be a page or 2, but at least put it down to let people know this is what we're looking for, and this is why. Like for the next couple of years, we're going to move in this direction. So we really need people with this type of background. And here's our timeline, and where do I send my expression of interest, you know, to. So you have some, you know, logic and structure to how you recruit. And that kind of process, I think most of you will know, well, that's just a standard HR recruitment process. Short answer is yes. It is a standard HR process. And again, put a little bit of discipline in there that when you do get that expression, you know, of interest or application, the board has to decide how you make those decisions. Do you have a nominating committee, like a little subcommittee of the board, to do that kind of first round of gauging, you know, who's a good match, who's not? Who's going to do some interviews? Is it going to be done by the board chair only, or are you going to have, you know, like a little panel from the board? And then how are decisions made? Is it the full board who makes them, or is it the nominating committee that will recommend a slate for the full board? So all those things take time. So you have to allow for those steps to happen. And most new board members come on stream around AGM. Most people have their AGM usually around May, June, or the fall. So you have to kind of back it up that if you have to nominate new board members at the AGM, you have to back up those steps a few months in advance. So in general, you want to allow for about 3 months. You know, from the time you start that discussion about, well, what do we need in terms of the mix to, you know, how you communicate it, get the process out there for people, and then having some sense of, you know, interviews, and then a determination of fit, and then having that decision. The other thing that I have found, that I have experienced that really makes me mad, people don't follow through for those who actually did not meet your needs at this moment in time. So people spend a lot of time, they care a lot about the organization, and if they're not going to be invited to join your board, be really, really polite. Send a note to people, pick up the phone, acknowledge that. Say, thank you so much, but, we'll keep your name on, and, when we go through the next round, your skill sets, will be a better fit. At this moment, we have a number of people that really bring what we need at this moment in time. So that just basic business etiquette needs to be there from day one to, day whatever whether it is. I may be a little bit long-winded, but these are things I keep seeing over and over again. And then people get mad, right? So, this organization, really didn't respect me that well, so why should I raise my hand and volunteer again? You turn them off. You turn them off. So just a little bit of the extra will go a long ways to not have people not coming back, because you may need them again, for another opportunity. And sometimes if it's not a good fit at the board level, you can also say, you know what, we also have committee level. How about you join us at the committee level? It may be less time onerous, but we really need you on this particular area, and give them a chance to see if they actually really like doing that or not. I'm just going to stop on the last good idea around board interviews. Some people just say, oh, and they don't organize themselves for board candidate interviews. They just have people who take their time, personal time, out of their very busy schedule to come and meet with you. I think the least you can do is to let people know and say it's going to be half hour, 45 minutes. It's going to be structured. We'll have 3 questions, or it's going to be just informal, but at least be transparent about it. Let people know who they're going to be meeting with, how it's going to be, how that discussion take place, and then convey, to them so, what the outcome is. When you do interviews, this is where some of the barriers come up too in terms of diversity. And again, you really do want to take a look at the type of questions you ask people and really put a diversity lens in there so that you're not just kind of putting blinkers on and you're blocking out a lot of other people just because that person has not spent 20 years within that particular sector you're in. Well, maybe you do need to have people from other sectors that, challenge your viewpoints a bit, but add a little bit of a different layer or a different lens to help you be a better organization. So I've actually kind of bundled a lot into the 5 good ideas, but if you reflect back on what I've said, is very much a full cyclical cycle of really looking at planning where your organization is going and then using that as the context to look at now, therefore, what's the leadership team we need at the board, level, and then taking a look at that and say, this is what we currently have, and this is what we're going to be losing for the people who have finished their term, and then also what else we would need on a go-forward basis. And then go about executing on that process to get those people. So Maytree, for example, does a wonderful job in terms of helping do the mix and match. So that's a source already in terms of board people who are ready, who have different backgrounds and diversity. So they actually, do a terrific job in terms of another additional source that you may not even know who some of those folks are that you're trying to, bring a different, mix to that table. And at the end of the day, as I said, once you get through, don't forget them. Once new people come on board, you got to help them settle in, get them oriented, and make them feel welcome. More often than not, I've seen people, especially if they're large boards, they just say, okay, well, you're here now, right? You sink and swim. Others actually do a very good job, not just with orientation, but they also do a good job with mentoring. Like the newer ones, if they have not served on any board at all, it's a good idea to partner them with a more seasoned board member so that they have somebody to, bounce ideas off and, check on how am I doing, just somebody who can actually provide a little bit of guidance to them. They're also formalized onboarding program. Maytree also, offers one. Some organization actually do it, themselves. And that just helps that person be successful in terms of integrating and then be able to be fairly effective earlier rather than wait another year before, oh, well, now I finally know what they're talking about. All these acronyms, I don't even know for 6 months what they're talking about. That means that person can't really help if they can't catch up fast enough. That means they don't feel like they can contribute as much as they would like to have. So I think I'm going to draw a close to my presentation. And I'm open to points of clarification, and then I'm going to have each of you at your tables talk a bit about what I've said and also reflect on a couple of things that are happening within your organization that actually are working well, that supports what I've said, and take that as a practice to share with others, and also talk about something that just did not work well. So again, we always learn from things that didn't go well faster than we learn from things that go well. And then coming back and sharing that back with everybody.